Good evening. How are we doing tonight, guys? Good. It is a pleasure to see you guys. For those that do not know me, my name is Pastor Mike Floyd. I oversee our groups and college ministry here at Grace Baptist Church. This is our fourth week on parenting in Babylon, and I'm excited about what we're going to get started. But before we do, just to recap, so last week we talked about holy sexuality. Me and Pastor Todd was able to present several things for us. And so there were some parenting action steps that we were able to give you. And so I hope that you went home and you've done those, and that was probably the easiest parenting action steps you have. It was very simple. You were to go home and to talk to your kids. So just real quick, we're going to do that self-grading technique. Just by show of hands, anybody do their homework? Anybody do their action steps? Anybody talk to their kids? Nobody talked to their kids this week. Man, we have failed already. So yeah, very simple. It was really, you got to have that conversation with your kids. You got to talk to your kids, and that's going to help you. And Pastor Todd last week talked about the way in which and how you talk to your kids, asking questions. One of those questions was, how do you come to that conclusion? That way you can understand how they derive there. So it was a great conversation last week, but we're going to continue to talk about parenting in Babylon. And this week we're going to talk about depression and anxiety. I can roll through a bunch of statistics about depression and anxiety among this generation, but I just do not have the time. And so I want to make sure that Pastor Todd has enough time to go through the material. And then afterwards, like we've done before, me and him will have a kind of question and answer time where we dive into some specific questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pray, and then Pastor Todd will kick us off tonight, okay? Let's pray. Our Lord and God, I thank you for today. I thank you for your grace, your mercy, your loving kindness towards us. It's my prayer that as we continue this series on parenting in Babylon, God, that you would guide us and that you would direct us. You know that there are kids out there that are struggling with depression and anxiety, but your word is faithful and true, God. And I just pray that as we look at your word, we could see the ways in which we can grow closer to you and effectively help our kids navigate the world that we find ourselves in. It's in your name that we pray. All who love the Lord said amen. All right, let's show some appreciation for Pastor Todd as he comes and joins us.
It's great seeing you all again this evening. It was so funny when Mike asked, did you talk to your kid? You should have seen the looks on your faces. It was like, almost like you had to. I get it. As I was trying to think about how to introduce this evening's talk, it's always a struggle when you only have a few moments to talk about really broad, complex concepts. And one of the things I want to start with is I want to read one quick verse of Scripture to kind of set the tone, and then I'll refer to others. But in Psalm 86:11, in the 1977 version of the New American Standard Bible, it says this: "Teach me thy way, O Lord, I will walk in thy truth. Unite my heart to fear thy name." And what stuck out to me in that verse is unite my heart. And what that implies is we all struggle with divided hearts. And I'm going to get into that tonight, and I'm going to show you that it's not just your heart that's divided, but your mind gets divided as well. Okay? And when I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I bring up this topic, the way I want to approach it is this. Anybody here have a grandmother that was a really good cook growing up? Okay, you know what you're with me now. I got it. In 1973 or so, my mom and dad got a divorce, and for a period of time, my sister and I and my mother stayed until they figured out all the custody stuff. We stayed with my grandmother, and I would get up early in the morning and watch her cook breakfast. And it was amazing, the most amazing thing. For some reason, I put a lot of weight on. I don't know what the deal was, but she could never tell you how she made what she made. I mean, there was no recipe from the standpoint of specific measurements that she could tell you that she did, but it just always tasted so good. And then, of course, when the custody stuff got all worked out, and I went to stay primarily with my father, I would get up in the morning and I would watch him fix breakfast. And well, let's just put it this way: when the stuff came out of Mama's oven, it was magic. when it came out of Dad's oven, it was tragic. And it was the same ingredients, but they weren't in the same measurement. It wasn't at the same time. Even if he could have even cooked it at the same time, but it just didn't taste the same. Y'all know what I'm saying? And so when we talk about depression and anxiety, it's really important that we take a look at the scope of the problem, but then we look at the primary ingredients that have led us to where we are. Because see, I don't have time, as Mike was saying, I don't have time to teach you cognitive behavioral counseling techniques in the few minutes we have. I can teach you how to love your kid and help them when they're dealing with depression. As a matter of fact, I was dealing with a couple this morning from Kentucky. They were Zoom call in to me, and she's a school teacher, and a teenager in her school where she teaches had just taken his life this week. And so it's a very real thing. So I want to talk a little bit. We'll start with just some statistics, and I'll mention them briefly because they're too big to ignore. But suicide rates have increased 76% for the ages of 15 through 19 in recent years. They've more than doubled in teen girls. The highest rate of increase in suicide among all age groups is kids between 10 and 14, believe it or not. And depressive symptoms are up 21% in girls, and 21% in boys and 50% in girls in recent years. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear those kind of numbers, it's kind of startling, and it seems that something is obviously terribly wrong. Here's what we do know. We know that our kids are struggling with anxiety, and we know that those rates have a starting point. Kids have always struggled, but it really started in 2007. Does anyone know what happened in 2007? You're carrying it in your pocket or you're holding it in your hand right now. Yep. The iPhone was introduced. And so Mike and I will get into that a little bit probably in our question and answer time. So that's one of the, we'll get into that. I'll even get into it in a moment, but that's one of the issues that we're dealing with. But what I sense when I talk to teenagers now, or when I consult with teachers who are working with teens that are struggling, is they all seem to be struggling with a sense of despair. They're struggling for meaning. They're having a hard time making sense of their worlds. It kind of reminds me, if you'll remember from the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon writes it at the end of his life, and he's looked over everything, and he basically says this, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he looks around and he basically says this, is life worth living here under the sun? That's like chapter 1, verse 3. That's the Todd paraphrase, but you'll get it. So what we see is the answer to that is yes, but it has to be in certain parameters. And so we have to take very seriously the fact that our kids are looking for meaning in life. As we get started, let me say this. If a kid asks us, if their kids are asking us as a group even, is there meaning in life? Well, technology can't answer that question. Prosperity can't answer that question. Society and culture can't answer that question. Only Christ can answer that question. And it reminds me of on Sunday when Pastor Mike referred to the woman at the well. I see these kids coming into the counseling center, and it's almost like they're the lady, they're that Samaritan woman, and they're carrying this bucket, and it's empty. And they're desperately trying to fill it with meaning. They are looking for meaning anywhere they can find it, and we have to provide an answer for them. So the answer, of course, Jesus gives the lady at the well is, you who you're looking for, I'm him. I'm the guy. So we got to help them turn to Christ, but we have to help them make sense of their experience first. So that brings me I want to cover three broad ingredients that I think have contributed to this anxiety, depression casserole that we're dealing with right now that none of us really want to eat. but it's there. And then I want to give you some anecdotes on what we need to do to kind of work through that. The first ingredient is what I'm going to call the rise of a dystopian view of culture. What do I mean by dystopian view? If you've ever watched The Walking Dead, anybody ever seen The Walking Dead or heard of it? Anybody got a friend that's ever watched it? Because nobody's going to admit to it, right? Movies like that, where what we see is a society, a world turned upside down and seemingly out of control, with a group of survivors just trying to live, right? And there's always lessons to be learned, but has it ever interested you? Now, one of the things, I think I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again for those of you who weren't here or those of you who have slept since then. I've done a lot of reading of Francis Schaeffer over the years. And Francis Schaeffer, in one of his books, he talks about how he's looking at art and how art, he says, everybody thinks that art, and when he means art, he means paintings, he means movies, he means TV shows, all that stuff. He thinks that drives culture. People think that drives culture. It does not. It reflects what's going on in the culture. And if you don't believe me, go back and look at movies in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Go back and watch those movies and then think about what was going on historically and tell me if I'm not right. It's amazing. It's a real good study to do. And so, since we've got these movies and these shows that almost, have you noticed like the latest shows there's no real good guy, there's no real bad guy, there's just these gray guys, and everything is just really, forgive me, it's depressing, right? Well, that's reflecting what society is seeing right now and experiencing. But when you take Christ out of everyday life, what do you expect? We blot out the sunshine and wonder why it's dark, don't we? And so the point being, we've got this culture that's been well steeped in that way of thinking. We like to revel in the gray. There is no more good guys and bad guys. It's a depressing thing. And then we have this culture of safetyism that we talked about last week, where we're overly like hawks watching our children, wrapping them in bubble wrap, so on and so forth, and we're teaching them repeatedly that the world's a dangerous, dangerous place, and there are some dangerous things we've got to take care of or we've got to watch out for, but the problem is that how is the kid ever supposed to learn to grow through adversity if we do our dead level best to make sure they never experience adversity? Right? Why is it that moms are going to interviews when kids don't get jobs and wanting to talk to the supervisor? Preach? You hear me? If you've done that, I'm sorry. Don't do that. That's not good. Do not play Marie Barone when Robert didn't get the job at the FBI. Right? That's the kind of thing we see going on. And if you don't believe me, ask educators in the Knox County, any school system, ask an educator the kind of attitude you get from parents. My father told me, he said, if you get, back in the day, when you get, I never will forget, I'm so sorry, this makes me laugh. This has totally nothing to do with anything, I'm running a squirrel. My sister got up one time in a group like this and was giving this talk. And she was giving a talk on whether you should paddle in schools or not. Except she got her terms messed up, and the whole talk, and she thought she nailed it. She kept referring to, instead of corporal punishment, she kept talking about capital punishment. And she kept talking about how she was a big advocate of capital punishment when children misbehave. Wow. She wondered why some of the parents really were into it. I don't know what the deal was, but I digress. When you get old like that, you chase rabbits. But the idea is that we aren't allowing our children to develop any kind of resilience and learn to overcome things because we're there to knock those things over before they have a chance to learn and grow. Okay? And that's not a healthy thing. So the first ingredient is this rise of a dystopian view of culture. In other words, where things are bleak, things are bad. We see it in movies, we see it in films, we see shows on Netflix like 13 Reasons, which is a show about why a kid committed suicide, for goodness sakes. And so, oh, by the way, and I'll jump in ahead a little bit here, but what do you think happens when, here recently, we put all that stuff on streaming services, right? And then what we do is we have a global pandemic where we take our kids out of school and put them at home all day long to watch that stuff on TV all day long by themselves, isolated from all their friends. Wonder what's going to happen. So the reason I'm bringing these kind of things up is I want you to see it's not really rocket science. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out 2 + 2 = 4 here, but we have to be aware of these are some of the factors that are feeding into what we're dealing with. So that's the first ingredient, this rise of a dystopian view of culture. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, and many of you know this, but it's ingredient 2, and it's what I'm going to call pairing problems in a wireless world. Anybody here ever been frustrated because you can't pair your wireless headphones to whatever you're listening to? Makes you crazy, doesn't it? Well, what's happening is when we pair something, we bring it together and it's connected, right? Well, what we're seeing is a dispairing internally of children right now, or students. This is what's going on, okay? And there's some reasons for that, and I'll get into that in a moment. But we're spending more and more time looking at screens, the kids are. And that has led directly, we have studies now that show kids that spend more time looking at screens experience more unhappiness and depression. And another thing that does is because you only have so much time that you are available to you, the more screen time you have, the less in-person social interaction you have. And that leads to more unhappiness and depression. It's the craziest thing. We live in the most connected time in the history of the universe, yet we're so disconnected. You can sit right there with the people right beside you in the pew and never really speak to each other. Isn't that amazing? And not even realize it's happening to you. Well, this is what's going on with our students. It is actually overtaken even how they interact socially. I learned a few years ago, there's this really elaborate ritual that goes on between a boy and a girl when they like each other and they're teenagers. And it has nothing to do with, hey, my name's Todd, would you like to go to the game on Saturday night? It's nothing like that. There's this whole set of, okay, I'm going to follow you on this, and then if you like me, you follow me back in a certain way, and if you don't, then you won't follow me back. And then if I say something too much, or oh goodness gracious, what if I called you and talked to you as a person face to face? It would freak them out. Do you see why our kids are maturing less quickly than they did back in the day? They're not getting the practice they need. And it's hard to when they're doing this the whole time. Okay? So that's another issue that we've got going on. So more screen time is a proven fact that it leads to more depression and unhappiness. Okay, that's the depression piece that we know. We know beyond a reasonable doubt more screen time will lead to more depression, period. Now, I'll talk in a little bit about what we can do to help that or to work on that. Teddy Roosevelt, at least I think that's where I'm getting this from. Teddy Roosevelt, I want to talk a little bit about anxiety now. Teddy Roosevelt once said that comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the thief of joy. Think about this. If you go to work and let's say they pay you a fair wage, you feel pretty good about yourself until you find out that the person right beside you is making $5 an hour more. Then what happens? I'm not so happy anymore. I'm underpaid. Workers of the world unite, right? And all that kind of stuff, right? No, the deal is all we want is a little bit more of what we don't have, okay? So what ends up happening is we find ourselves comparing, and social media makes this really, really interesting in how it works because it affects us. There's something, there's a theory out there where we see what happens is think about this. When you look at how a family looks on social media, Am I fair to say it's true-ish? Maybe? It's not really completely real, is it? But that's what we're comparing to, isn't it? Do you know there are apps? There are apps that are designed to actually make you look a whole lot better than you look in real life. Okay? Now, I want y'all to go back to being 14, 15, 16 years of age. I know you're going to find this hard to believe. I remember my dad complaining to my mom, Connie, that boy primps in front of the mirror, always messing with his hair. Now, I know you find that hard to believe. If you ever watched the show Seinfeld, when I had hair, I looked like Kramer. So my wife finally was just glad it was all gone. But the idea is that we are comparing. Social comparison theory is what it's called. And we will tend to compare ourselves with others in order to see kind of how we measure up. It's human nature to do this, right? Well, what happens, though, when what we're comparing to is not really real, right? When my son, when he swam in college, he swam at a NAIA school, and so how do you think he would have felt about himself if he continually compared himself to Michael Phelps? Is he going to feel like he measures up? Of course not. And what the social psychologists say is the best thing to do is measure yourself with your peer group of normalcy. The problem is, with all these apps and things, what's normal anymore? Do you see what I mean? What's normal? Because the picture you see, the girl looks like a supermodel, and you just saw her at church the other day. She looks like she's like 12, and she looks like she's 26. Do y'all see that? It's not a legitimate comparison. But when you take a kid who is insecure anyway, and all they see, because they're spending all this time in front of a phone or on a phone, all they see is all this what they don't have. It automatically leads to feelings of anxiety. Now, I want to walk through something else too on how this can kind of work. There's a pastor that's one of the student pastors in the region. I won't say the local area, but I see him for other reasons. He's a good guy, more life coaching than anything. He was explaining to me the other day, there's a new social media app. I think it's called Get Real. That may be it. Be Real? Be Real. Is that it, Chloe? Be Real? See, I got to ask the young people. I have no idea. There's an app out there, and she can tell you the right thing or not. I'm going to tell you what I was told. Apparently, the idea in the app is to, at any given moment, you'll get an alert. And what you're supposed to do is take a picture, just how you look, and one picture, and then another picture of what's going on in your life. But it's supposed to be real, right? You know what these kids are doing now? The alert goes off, but they wait until they can get to the beach and get all dolled up. And then you know what they do? Remember when they're supposed to take that picture out in where they are? They flip it around and take another picture of themselves. Narcissistic much? Do y'all see that? Here's what's going on. The fact is that social media has encouraged individualism almost to a grotesque level. And then, as such, a focus on individualism, given the sinful human heart, unequivocally and inevitably always leads to narcissism. The social narcissist will get a dopamine hit when they get a like on social media. And then once they get used to that, they start craving it, and they need that affirmation. If you've ever worked with a young person, I'm an online professor, it would amaze you how quickly they need feedback, and they need it right now. And it's like, I remember those days. You remember where it took 3 weeks for the professor to get the paper back to you? Not anymore. It's like 3.6 seconds. Where are you? Huh? Tell me. Come on, Dr. Harden, where are you? So what's happening is we've got a system that's working in such a way where it encourages comparison, and it also encourages this individual expression But the individual expression, by the way, because you want to fit in with your peer group but be different, you have to doll yourself up and not look like you really are. And then you're comparing yourself to people that, by the way, they're not real either, but boy, they look good that you can't be like. That encourages narcissistic behavior. And it almost conditions them, because what happens is they will post something and they check their phones incessantly, waiting on likes to hit, because they need the dopamine hit in their brains. Okay? When they don't get the dopamine hit, let me tell you what happens. A hormone called cortisol starts being excreted. And cortisol is a stress hormone. And what cortisol does, for lack of a better term, is it splits your brain. It keeps the feeling part and the thinking part of your brain separated. Okay? That's the stress, because see, if God gave us cortisol so that we can run away from lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, right? So that we wouldn't go, I wonder what the odds are of this thing eating me. Maybe I ought to think about running, right? But what happens is after prolonged exposure to cortisol, it always results in a chronic depressive state. And it limits your ability to think and reason. So we have a system here where they're continually being rewarded in a way that actually reinforces narcissism. And then the narcissism, you got to remember about narcissism too. Narcissism is really, when you get down to the root of it, is a very fragile sense of self. That's why they have to be all bigger and all better and all this kind of stuff. It's really a front. But it's a very fragile sense of self. And so when they don't get the likes that they think they deserve or they need, it creates a sense of anxiety. There's a habit cycle they kind of go through. I teach this in the counseling center. There's 4 steps in a habit cycle. There's this thing called a cue, which is something comes across your radar screen, and it incites something called a craving. And when we get the craving, we're compelled to respond to it, and then we respond and we get a reward. So it's almost like, no one's liked me today. That's the cue. And then it's like, I need some likes, so then that's the craving. And so then the response is, here, let me post something else even more outlandish. There we go. There's some likes again. Do you see what happens? And it happens over and over and over again. So if affirmation is withheld, the dopamine goes away and the person experiences withdrawals. And so that's the second ingredient, is the fact of all this time on the screen is leading us to be despaired. It's splitting our brains. It's splitting our kids' brains, okay? And it's creating an environment where cortisol is continually being pumped into your bloodstream, which is causing it to get worse and worse. And I've worked with, one of my first specialties was working with chronically depressed people. And one of the things with chronically depressed people is it's usually not a genetic thing. It's like a trigger event, like a loved one, for instance, that gets ill for a long term, and you get caretaker burden, or you've got a sick child, or you've got a disabled child or something. And what happens is it's like the unhealable wound that won't go away. And so people are always stressing over the issue. And that's when the cortisol keeps going. It's like our bodies are made to run in turbo for very short periods of time. When you try to run your body in a turbo speed all the time, what happens is it starts to break down. And this is what's going on daily with our teenagers. They're seeking that affirmation because there's this hole they think they need to fill, and it's causing these problems. So that's the second ingredient. The third ingredient is really quite obvious, but it's true, and it's that kids are developmentally vulnerable. By definition, our teen years are marked by transitions, and transitions always lead to vulnerability. I want you to think of a college football player. He's running down the field, and he starts, and here comes the tackler, is coming up on him. He's got the ball in his right hand. The tackler's coming this way. The period that's the scariest if you're on the team with the ball is when he transitions the ball to the left hand, because that's when a fumble can occur. And teen years are one transition after another transition after another transition, and from time to time, they're going to fumble. We have to be there to help them pick the ball back up. So So you just got to understand that. They're not 45-year-old people. We also know, like I said this earlier, that teens are maturing more slowly than in previous generations. Our neurological wiring is still not completely connected, and we're not integrated whole people yet. And so if you introduce cortisol into all of that, where you keep it separated, how are they supposed to ever see neurons that wire together or fire together, wire together? Okay? And so we've got to help them rewire their brains as parents. So you've got to understand too, you may have forgotten this because it's been a while since you've been teens, but feeling alienated is part of being a teenager. You don't know who you are. All you know is that you know more than mom and dad do, right? And so that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. Is you've got these nasty casseroles that are baking in your home called teenagers. And it's got these three things. You've got this dystopian view of culture. You've got too much screen time and all that goes along with that. And then you've also got simply these kids are growing up and they're developing. And so when you put those ingredients together, you shake them up, you put it in the oven. When you pull it out, are you expecting anything different given the circumstances we're dealing with right now? So that's the case. Let me talk a little bit about what we need to do to help. I'm going to give a general solution, and I'm going to give those specific steps, and you'll see the specific steps are in your handout. And by the way, there's some stuff written on the other side that you could benefit from. But the general solution, I'm going to say, is instill hope in our children. Remember last week's assignment was talk to your kids? Well, that's part of the connecting process. We need to offer our kids home base, a place where they can talk to us. And we do this by imaging God to them. As Solomon answers at the end of Ecclesiastes, after he asks, is life meaningful? He says, yes, but if you want to experience a meaningful life, fear God and keep his commandments. Chapter 12 tells us that, right? Well, as you image God, you are fearing God and you're keeping his commandments, and you're providing a solid, predictable, stable place for your kids to figure out who they are. Okay? And so we don't always do that real well. Did you know that? As parents, we don't always do that real well. So that's the general solution. We want to be able to pursue a personal connection with our kids, because when we pursue a personal connection with our kids and we talk to them, and usually it'll be at their level that they want to connect, especially in certain ages they get. But the idea is, see, what we're doing there is we're decreasing cortisol and we're increasing, do y'all remember the cuddle hormone, oxytocin? Anytime, I can still hear my mama's voice, she's still with us, I experience an oxytocin rush. Do y'all see what I'm saying? We need to be able to connect with our children. I don't care how old they are, even though it'll have to be on their terms a lot of times. And then we disciple and mentor them both in the Bible and in life skills. Now I want to get to this. This is the specific steps you need to take in obeying God by imaging him properly to your kids. The first, this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but that's okay. I would say I'm on tenure, but I'm not. But I'm going to tell you the truth. Grow up. And here's what I mean. Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 6:12 said he would not be dominated by anything. Well, you have got to lead your kid by example. Don't be so tied to your own phone and social media that you're totally oblivious to your kids. As the ESPN segment always says, is you had one job. Launch your kids safely into adulthood in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And so what I mean by that, growing up, is, I don't know how to say this, it's not always about us as parents, is it? Now that doesn't mean we worship our children, but what it does mean is that we provide them with a stable environment and we're accessible to them, okay? I've told you about the one thing with the families, the moms and dads would be sitting in the same room texting each other instead of talking. That's not a good model to set for your kid, okay? So grow up. Show up. I think about what I mean by that is be present, but you don't have to be intrusive. I'm here for you, sweetheart. Sometimes they don't want you right there up all in their business, but they want you to be accessible. It's almost like if they're upset, they don't want you sitting on the bed with them while they cry, but they would love to have you right outside the door in case they need you. That's what I mean by that. Be available to your kid, okay? And by the way, that's not only your little kids, that's your kids. And some of y'all have 45-year-old kids you still need to be able to show up for. So I think of Jesus coming to the disciples in Matthew 14:27. Remember, he was walking on the water, and where do you want him to look? Right here, right? Look at me. I'm here. Don't worry. I got you. And so we have to provide that kind of vibe to our children. So we need to grow up. In other words, we need to lead by example, and we need to show up. We need to be present but not intrusive, and we need to see them. And I think of Jesus when he saw Luke 7:13, when he saw the widow from Nain. Remember the one that lost her only son? It says he saw her. He could have kept on going. He saw her, and he had compassion on her, if you'll remember that. And he raised the guy, and he gave him back to his mom. But what I'm getting at here is when I mean see your kid, what I mean is meet emotion with emotion and meet logic with logic. If your kid's having a hard day, talk to them about what they're experiencing. It's okay. We'll get into this in a minute, but it's not a time to lecture them, and I'll explain that in a minute. But meet emotion with emotion and logic with logic. The next step is just listen. I think of Proverbs 18:13 where it talks about he who gives an answer before he hears is a fool. Well, help them process their emotions. Now, if you have a real hard time with emotional processing yourself, I'm sorry, we can help you with that at Grace Biblical Counseling, 865-985-0660. But go back to step one of growing up. You brought a little being into this world that God has put you in charge of developing and growing. And so meet them where they are and help them process their emotions. That just means let them talk about it. It's okay. Now, the key here is don't lecture them, because the problem with lecturing is lecturing activates the logical part of the brain. And listening, though, activates the emotional part of the brain. And so the kid is primarily having an emotional problem, so listen first, you can lecture later. When they're upset, meet them where they are. There's a whole thing I could talk to y'all about that I've talked to GCA, some of their teachers about. But just meet them where they are and don't lecture them. And the next thing's really important. Speak life. You know, Paul in Ephesians 4:29 talks about lifting others up and with their speech. And we also see in Proverbs 22:29, a man skilled with his work won't stand before obscure men, but he'll stand before kings. And what I mean by that is give hope and encouragement to your kid. Speak purpose and passion and paint a vision. Remember, children or students their if-then clickers aren't working very well. They don't see what they could be, but you do often. And so helping remind them of not only whose they are, but who they are and what they could become helps them stay focused on where they need to be instead of just floundering around. Okay? Really important. So speak life, paint a vision. And then the last thing is called promote grit or grit. And grit is simply the combination of resilience, ambition, and self-control in the pursuit of a goal. Model and encourage resilience as a way of life. And promote something that we call a growth mindset. We talk a lot about this at GCA, and we talk a lot about it at the Counseling Center. A growth mindset is a way, I think of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was asked about all of his failures when he was trying to invent things. And he said, I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that won't work. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Help our kids see that there are 10,000 ways that won't work, but boy, there's one that will, and let's keep working at it till we find it. So, never, when I'm talking about that kind of thing, as far as teaching them, don't overlook teachable moments. Spend every moment, make it a teachable moment if you can. Now, if you do all this, the reason I'm bringing all this up is because it really goes back to some of the stuff we talked about last week. We can't control a lot of things that are going on in Babylon, okay? We can't. We're here. But we can take care of what's in front of us and who we're in charge of. And what I mean by that is we need to be able to speak life into our children, provide them with a safe home, a place where they can grow in their admonition of the Lord. We need to increase and not decrease, as God told the Israelites in Jeremiah 29. And so we do that by promoting connection and talking to our children. If they need help, let's get them help. But often what they need is a good listening ear from somebody they love and respect. And I see a whole room of people that are eminently qualified for that. So keep that in mind. And if you have any questions, of course, email me or call the counseling center. But the idea is what we're trying to do is we're providing stability, and we want to get the cortisol to come down. We want the oxytocin to go up, and we want their brains to be united instead of discombobulated. We want to pair them up really well, okay? Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this group of individuals. They're such a blessing to be able to address. And Father, thank you for giving us the watch care over these children. Father, they're precious bundles of joy for us, and we're here to do what we can to glorify you by raising them. Father, help us get out of our own way so that we can grow up, show up, see them, just listen, speak life, and promote grit. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys.
Amen. Appreciate you, Pastor Todd. It's a lot to take in when you're dealing with teenagers, but I think, it's very important that we deal with that. And I like the way that you broke that. I think the first thing you said, grow up. It's our responsibility as parents. So that's a high calling. Mm-hmm. It really, truly is, and to be able to speak life into them. So let's tackle some stuff. So I do want to spend some time, Pastor Todd. So you talked a lot about, the iPhone. You said 2007. Correct me if I'm wrong. Your statistic was a lot of things changed in 2007, and that was when Steve Jobs famously said, "Wait, there's more," mm-hmm. and he pulled out the iPhone,
right.
Which iPhone stands for Internet for those that are uninitiated. So he pulled out the Internet phone, and it changed the way that we communicated and connected with each other. So talk about the impact of social media and screen time on our kids holistically, and then I do want to dig on the females and why they're a little bit different.
Okay. It's the craziest thing because it's this oxymoron kind of thing because, in a way, isn't it amazing how you can talk to somebody across the world right away, yet what it does is it's a different way of connecting. We don't like to admit that, but then, think about this. How would you feel, those of you who have Facebook, now I don't have Facebook, how would you feel if a friend of yours that you've never seen in person showed up at your house?
My house?
Would that creep you out a little bit?
They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that.
Right. Because they're not really friends, are they? So the idea is we've bought into this false dichotomy, if you will, of we think we're connected, but we're actually disconnected, and we're alone. And we're in a little room in front of a screen, and we're not really talking to people. There's a different thing. When I noticed it, Mike, the most was when we came back from pandemic. The pastors, we always get here and we pray with people and we walk around early. And I remember when we got back from the pandemic and I saw you guys for the first time in several months.
Yeah.
I realized I didn't know what I'd been missing, human contact. You know what I mean? And so I think that's happening a lot right now, and that's leading to some of this problem.
Yeah, so do you have is there an age range that you would recommend, hey, social media, so like for the elementary school parents, recommend social media? Yeah. Like what's your thought process with that?
The ideal age to let a person start social media is probably about 47.
I see a lot of amens, yeah. I'm gonna dig with this. So for us, we've told Piper she's not getting into 18.
Yeah.
Because I see the effects of it. I see what it's done. I see the way that it's changed. Facebook themselves, guys. I hope you do this. Go Google it. Facebook themselves they did a study, and in their own internal study, they have found that social media is not good for teenagers. And it really is not good for teenage girls. We're going to dig in that in a second. So I think it's interesting that they found that, hey, these algorithms are not good for teenagers. Let's just sweep that under the rug and not tell anybody. Meanwhile, they're still producing and they're trying to get our kids on these devices. That's why it's up to parents to be the safeguards.
What you have to remember, too, is capitalism in the bad way is what these tech giants are doing.
Yeah.
They're trying to keep everybody's eyes glued on that app for as long as possible. And they've hired psychologists that are very specialized in understanding. There's two ways you can really get a reaction out of a person. You can scare them, or you can make them angry. Now, I want you to think about this age of social outrage, cancel culture, all this stuff, and then you throw postmodernism in where we don't need any context of truth, and then we can just go, I think because those chairs over there are black, we need to cancel them. How crazy is that, right? It's totally disconnected from reality, right?
No.
So that's what we got going on.
Yeah. So dig a little bit. The one of the studies it shows, and you talked about it a little bit last week, how females specifically suffer greater when it comes to social media involvement, and the research will tell you that you should not let a teenager female on social media at all.
Right. Well, of course, teenagers, as we talked about, teenage girls specifically historically are social contagions, right? They're social carriers of things. So if one has a problem, be it cutting, be it eating disorder, be it depression, be it transgenderism, whatever it is, her friend group will tend to also spike up the same problem. So they've got that going on because they're really complex. Boys are more simple when it comes to that kind of thing. They're more practical. They're like pickup trucks instead of Lamborghinis, I guess would be the best way to put it. So that's part of the problem. Then you have the body expectation situation with social comparison going on with teenage girls. Remember, they're growing as well, and they go through the chubby stage, or they go through, and they don't feel, and they feel bad. They look at other girls, and they feel like inferior. And then here's another thing that's really terrible. We see this more with girls. Girls are more apt to do a character type assassination on social media than boys will, although boys will do it. Boys, you may find out in the back in a fist fight.
Typically.
Right? But girls will try to assassinate each other's character, and social media makes it so much easier.
Right.
Right? And think about that. That's those are some of the reasons why girls struggle a little bit more, I think. It's more complicated for them.
Yeah. So that's why, the dangers, and we talked about, the digital dangers, we've done that. But we want to continue to reinforce that the dangers of social media is real. That is one of the reasons, and you talked about that earlier, why we're seeing the anxiety, why we're seeing this typical depression. When you're always, and I love the phrase you use, if you're always on turbo, at some point, and I was thinking about, video games, you don't have turbo all the ways. You got to turn it off at some point. So if you have kids that are always on and they're always on social media, and I would even challenge you, take their phone. Take their phone away if you have it, and see how they react. And if all of a sudden they start acting weird, then okay, there's an addiction, and that's typically what social media does.
You'll see the extent of the problem, right? You'll see the extent of the problem. You'll see, oh my goodness, this is bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked about early, you mentioned the fact that the rise of dystopian view of culture, and when you said that, one of the things that made me think about, so you mentioned, you talked about a movie, but it made me think about a different particular movie. You're talking about The Walking Dead, I think it was. I don't watch that show. That show's weird. But I thought about it again. I went back to Katniss Everdeen and Hunger Games, and what some of these kids grew up around, and reason why, because I thought about the fact, think about, Katniss Everdeen, Hunger Games, think about
Game of Thrones maybe would be in that. Game of Thrones may fall into that.
Game of Thrones, but mainly some of the other ones though, the Harry Potters. Typically, what you see in that though, Todd, is the kids are the one who solves the problem. The adults have the issue, and it's the kids who have to rise to the occasion to solve the problem. And so some of the social unrest that we're seeing and things that we're seeing play out in our culture, again, these movies and things like this, art is just depicting what's already going on in the culture at large, right? So that was one of, to me, I think is very interesting. So pay attention to the movies, the shows that our kids are watching. I think, go ahead.
And not only just for, the guardianship piece of that, I think it's interesting for you to watch it just to understand what's going on in society a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because, see, our kids are going off to school, they're going off into society. What are they swimming in? And I think it's really important to understand that because things like movies will tell you that. You'll be able to see that.
Yeah, I know some of the parents lament the fact that most of the movies now are superhero movies, and I'm sitting there going, your kids are telling you they are in need of a hero. They are in need of some kind of person to save them. They're in this big bad world, and they need a hero, and yet we're not paying attention to the culture enough.
And what we're seeing in a lot of these superhero movies, and you're the expert on this compared to me, because I want to run my head through that wall over there sometimes trying to watch some of that, is that, when many of us were growing up, when you had like Batman or Superman, there was definitely a good guy and there was definitely a bad guy. Now it's kind of this anti-hero type thing. Nobody's a good guy. And they're cool that way. And that's what's looked up to and valued right now.
Exactly. But it again, if you're looking at where your kids are at and where they're at, if you meet them in that world, if you're going, okay, well, let's watch this movie together, let's have a conversation about this particular movie. Well, why do you like that? Or this particular video game or what have you, it allows for that particular conversation to keep going. Todd, you talked about this a little bit. How can I tell when I need to seek help for my child about depression or anxiety? What are some signs I need to look for? One
of the things, and this all depends, so I'm going to take this with a grain of salt because it all depends on developmental level, but some of the kind of things I'm asking when a parent will call in, and I will usually meet with mom and dad first, get a feel for what's going on, because who knows the kid better than they do, right? Talk to them, and what I'm asking are things like this. What changes have you noticed? What's going on in school? It's really quite amazing because sometimes they'll be a little upset, but they're getting straight A's still. But when you've got a straight A kid that all of a sudden's laying out of class and not going, and and having panic attacks in the class and things like that, not eating, things like that, no longer hanging out with their friends.
Right.
There's stuff like that. Look behaviorally first. What looks odd to you from your kid, and start from there. And if you have a concern, I think you need to reach out and talk to somebody. A lot of times you can just be reassured or said, hey, have you tried this? That kind of thing. But there may need to be some help, and if there is, we'll get you some help.
Yeah, so a kid that typically talks a lot, all of a sudden is quiet.
They're withdrawn,
Yeah. So even partnering with your teachers and things like that and say, have you noticed this type of behavior also?
Okay, that's a really good point. I think you need to do everything you can to team with the teachers in your kid's school. They're there to help, and they're seeing your kid more hours often than you are, quite frankly. So make a team with them and try to understand if they're seeing something that you're not seeing.
I'm going to do this real quick. My mom, when she would team up with teachers, it's very simple. You know what she would say, Todd? She would tell me that she's going to believe that teacher regardless of what I said. I think we need to kind of go back to that where you take the teacher, because the teacher's the adult in the room. The adult typically knows what's going on. And so you take that side of the teacher first, and then you go, okay, well, you acting crazy in the teacher's classroom. We walked that road with Piper. She knows that, we are believing the teacher before we even believe her. I just felt like I need to share that.
No, that's okay. I was thinking of Brenda, those early teaching conferences, in elementary school. The first thing out of her mouth, what'd he do? It wasn't, save my little baby angel. No, what'd he do?
Exactly. I think one of the things that, when you talk about screen time, whether that's social media, whether it's TV, or in my generation is video games, but one of the things it does, though, this generation is a generation that's isolated. They're typically in the house, on their phone. Talk to us a little bit about why it's important for kids, teenagers, to get outside and be around others in the flesh, face to face.
Yeah, well, Genesis 2 tells us that it wasn't good for man to be alone. So we are created as relational beings, but no more so usually than teenagers. And here's why. Remember how I said earlier, teenagers are in this transition phase from one thing to another. The way they scaffold from being a kid to being an independent adult usually is through a network of social friendships they have along the way.
Right.
And so when we pull those out, or if those are really not working the way God intended them to work, as far as me learning how to interact and negotiate with you on the playground, those kind of things, right? When that goes away, okay, then all of a sudden I'm out in the real world, kind of like Robert Barone was in the illustration I brought, where Marie, my mom, is showing up at the FBI because I didn't get the job, because I'm ill-prepared.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we encourage as much as we can teenagers, kids to get out,
Yeah.
be around other peers,
Yeah.
play some recreational sports, extracurricular
Have them at
activities.
your house too. By the way, if you feel a little bit iffy on something, have them over at your place to entertain. That's helpful.
Yeah, and I would say this: put their phones away.
Yeah.
Get them around some peers that are going in the right direction. And for those that you have kids, you have teenagers, man. If they're not in a group, if they're not in something's wrong. And I love our student ministry. I was talking to Pastor Brian earlier today. Man, they got groups for your students. Our middle school groups they meet Sunday morning. So if you got a middle schooler and you're like, well, they don't have friends. They haven't made any. Well, come to group. That's typically the first place you're going to meet some people and get connected. So you should go. If you got middle schools, they got groups in the morning at 9 a.m. The high school the high school students, they meet throughout the evening time. But there's a group and there's a place, and I love how Pastor Brian put it. He said there's a place for them to belong. And so you need for them, especially if they're believers, man, they are facing many challenges, and you got them out there, all alone by themselves, thinking that they're gonna do it. Last time I checked, the Avengers had a bunch of people on the same team.
That's right.
If you got Iron Man teaming up with Spider-Man, and meanwhile you got your middle schooler or high schooler just trying to love Jesus by themselves in their house, that ain't gonna work, y'all.
Yeah.
They got to be around some other people that understand their struggle, but not just understand their struggle, that can challenge them. Yeah. I love peer pressure in the positive way. Yeah. Yeah. Like, where are you at? I hadn't seen you in group. Where you been at?
I'll tell you another thing you bring up too. Get your kids involved in what we have here at church, in the school, if they're in the school system here at GCA. One of the main reasons is that this is good from a parent's perspective, because I know there's a bunch of other eyes on my kid. Mm-hmm. Okay? I know that I've got a church brother or sister, you know what I mean, that I can say, did you see Tucker Hardin was doing what? You know what I mean? And so it just helps them keep those rails up to keep them safe, but let them grow in their interactions and stuff.
Exactly. I think that's so important. And speaking of, them being in a group, Todd, I'd be remiss if I didn't say it. You as a parent should be in a group as well. You cannot grow by yourself. You have to be. This is so true. Genesis 2 is right. We were created for a relationship, and it's one of those unique things about us. And I think that when you think about anxiety and depression, typically what's happening is that somehow we started isolating ourselves from people and the things that can help us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so being together in community is so important. I think it's needful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pastor Todd, what are the parenting action steps that you would give for us today? So now, we've done, last week you told us to talk to the kid. You gave a lot of hard work, Todd.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk to your child.
I'm gonna follow up with talk to your kid by connect with your kid. Now, that can look different for each of you. It may be, I'm going to Home Depot, who wants to go, right? That kind of thing, but it's that engaged, not just shoulder to shoulder stuff, but it's face to face, hanging out, doing something. Okay? It's in those little moments, you have no idea what a difference it makes for your kid. It's not the glamorous stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's not the, one real quick story that I learned this kind of in a backwards way. Tucker and I used to have, now he's 24 now, but when he was in 4th, 5th, 6th grade in that area, we would go to Cracker Barrel every Saturday morning and have what we would call Breakfast of Champions, okay? And at the beginning of this, I had this Bible study, this devotional time. I carried my big family Bible in. I need a big table to set this thing down on. And boy, I would lecture and preach to him, and it just wasn't seeming to connect with him. And I thought, I
don't know why.
I need to replan that. And so what I started doing was, I got a smaller Bible, by the way. It was that one right there. It works much better. He got his Bible, but we would go in, but it would be less pressure. And what I would do is I would ask him what had gone on at school that week. And he would start telling me stuff of going on with his buddy or this person or that person. And what I would use is that as a springboard for the gospel or for a Bible story or for teaching a Christian principle. He still talks about that. He's 24 years old with a kid of his own, and he still talks about when Dad took him to Breakfast of Champions. Now, I messed up a whole bunch of other places, but that one I accidentally got right. So I would encourage you, connect with your kid this week. That's the assignment.
I like that. Everybody took away. Go to Cracker Barrel.
Go to Cracker Barrel. I'll walk in there, and there'll be gray sites everywhere.
Exactly. Exactly. You take me to Cracker Barrel on a weekly basis. I like that too. But I think you're absolutely right about there are those moments where Jasmine and I we have with Piper where we'll ask her what was meaningful. I remember the other day she was just beaming about the fact that she for some reason likes to wrestle me. She likes to beat me up. And so the other day we really had a long wrestling match, and she was like, "It was so fun. I got to beat you up, Daddy," and what have you. And it's